I became interested in certificate of need maybe a dozen years ago or so, which was during my early time of becoming aware of AAPS. I finished residency in '06 for anesthesia, and a couple of years after that became aware of Keith Smith's Surgery Center of Oklahoma, loved the whole transparent price model, and still in my mind would love to eventually get there myself. You know, it's a little tougher for us anesthesiologists to throw up a shingle and have a direct anesthesia care practice, but you know, hopefully networking as we do, we can turn into more Keith Smiths out there. So I have no financial disclosures. My opinions are my own. Certainly my healthcare associated facilities would not necessarily endorse what I have to say. And, you know, I think you're safe, but, you know, trigger warning, I don't know what I'm going to get into. A little bit of this is ad lib. Exits are in the back if you get uncomfortable or if there are any closet statists in our midst. I'll be referencing heavily two organizations throughout this kind of update of what's going on with Certificate of Need laws as I can find them. The Institute for Justice is one of them, and the Mercatus Center is another. There are lots of great organizations out there following this topic, and probably experts in this room, which would be doing a much better job than I will of giving you updates here, but I was the one that said yes to the lecture, so here we are. If you're not familiar with Institute for Justice, they're a great organization. They do a lot of pro bono work for people that need defense in the areas of civil liberties and constitutional issues and government overreach. And they always get a couple of bucks from me every year. And so this is a topic that they do work on as well and have represented physicians in this realm. The Mercatus Center is another great source of information. Now they don't work on the litigation side, but rather on the policy side. And Mercatus being Latin for markets, their policy work, their research focuses on free market and market-oriented policies and ideas. They don't receive any money from George Mason University. They've got a very loose affiliation with them, so they're very independent. They're a 501c3 and are able to maintain that type of independence that doesn't get bogged down in what we would see in kind of the leftist academia of today. So some updates. And did I show you Mercatus Center? Mercatus.org. So as I've been clicking around, trying to see what's going on around the country in the last couple of years, North Carolina pops up a lot. And just for the record, North Carolina is the most bogged down with certificate of need categories and legislation. That's the most difficult state to operate out of in this regard. This article is out of a paper in Asheville, North Carolina from June of this year, and revolves mainly around the story of Dr. Jay Singleton. He's an ophthalmologist. You know, ophthalmologists, I'm sure there are multiple in the room, they're able to do procedures like cataracts at a small surgery center and get their best and most, economic type work done in that type of setting. Well, of course, he was denied the ability to operate fully in surgery centers and ended up filing a lawsuit. And initially, maybe that looked good, but that was dismissed by the judge there. And the article also mentions a recent MRI scanner denial for a cancer center. I mean, who would not benefit as a cancer patient to having an MRI scanner right there where you're getting your treatment and diagnosis? And then also an orthopedic group that was denied additional outpatient operating rooms. From that article, it says the law requires Singleton, the ophthalmologist, to perform most outpatient surgeries at a hospital. His attorneys said that physicians have to obtain a certificate of need, or abbreviated to CON, from the state to operate a formal surgical facility, but officials there in that state decided there is no need for new surgical facilities. Now, how do you determine what a true need is? That's very subjective and I'm sure political as well. And Singleton and his attorneys And his attorneys point out that by doing his procedures in hospitals, the patients are being charged, and the insurance providers as well, obviously, are being charged additional thousands of dollars to do this at a hospital as opposed to a surgery center. And one of his attorneys, who was provided by the John Locke Foundation, which I haven't researched them, but great for them. I'm glad to see more foundations out there involved in this. They recognize this as a clear case of economic protectionism. And as I go through the presentation here, I think that's one of the key points that needs to be realized is this is a racket that protects the existing institutions and the big health centers and reduces competition. On the topic of North Carolina, I told you they're the worst when it comes to certificate of need categories and laws, but as a source of optimism, just this past summer, the legislators introduced 8 new bills that would potentially reform or repeal parts of their con laws. So that's great to see. Now, critics of certificate of need, like most of us in this room, if not all, we believe that the con laws reduce access to care and they drive costs up. Interestingly, you have groups out there that argue the exact opposite. So you've got the National Conference of State Legislatures that say price inflation can occur when a hospital cannot fill its beds, and fixed costs must be met through higher charges for the beds that are used. And in a sense, I get what they're saying. They have all this big infrastructure with fixed costs, and if they don't pull people in to pay for it, then how do you pay those bills? But it's also like saying, hey, if we don't keep the monopoly, then prices are going to go up. And I remember attending either a free market medicine association or AAPS meeting some years ago, and Tom Woods, if you're familiar with him, he was talking about some of this stuff, and his point was, your bad business model isn't my problem. The fact that you have such fixed costs, that's just an example of how inefficient you are, and it's not my responsibility to support the bloat. And really, when you talk about hospital costs, and even in this environment of relatively low competition, if they want to argue that competition would increase prices, it's kind of hard to imagine prices being any higher than they are, or have risen at a rate any higher than they have. And the American Enterprise Institute put up a great graphic that looked at 20 years of price changes across multiple sectors. And so if you follow that chart down toward the bottom, you've got electronics, you have things like clothing and household items that have seen mild inflation and price rise. But then if you look at the top of the chart, you've got hospital services over 20 years that have risen 200%. You also see up there college tuition and costs that have risen extremely high as well. And so the rate of rise is off the chart almost. And so for me, I look at this chart and I ask, well, what's the underlying issue? What's the correlation there? And if you want to consider what the government intervention is into each of those sectors, I think there's a correlation there. Absolutely, for hospital and medical services, we see massive amounts of government, I would say intrusion, regulation into those sectors, and the result is price inflation. And I had submitted these slides before I thought of adding this extra chart, and I neglected to do that. But many of you may remember having seen a chart by the Foundation for Economic Education that charts the growth of physicians versus the growth of administrators in healthcare. And that goes back to the 70s, and it's brought forward almost to present day, I think. And the rate of rise of physicians over that 40 plus years has been relatively stable. It's something like this. Now, the rate of administrative burden is something like that. And the actual percentage, I think, was somewhere around 2,500% growth since the 1970s. So if we want to argue that certificate of need laws is necessary for cost constraints, I don't think that's what's going to fix the problem. And mostly what we're seeing are health systems gobbling up our small practices, our independent hospitals, and getting bigger and bigger. Still in North Carolina, let's look at the story of Dr. Gajendra Singh. Institute for Justice has a great little video and article for his situation, which didn't turn out great, unfortunately. But he's a surgeon in Winston-Salem. He was running, it says Imagine Center. You can imagine a transparent pricing in medicine, but it's an imaging center. And he wanted to run a low-priced access point for his patients to get their diagnostics and their follow-up. And that center is now closed, but I was able to find some historic pricing from a transparent pricing website, which I now forget which exactly one it was, but it still had his prices up on their website. So you could get an ultrasound there for $200, X-ray for $70, CAT scan for $400. He wanted an add an MRI scanner. Of course, he was denied by North Carolina. To run through all the process of the application fees and the appeals fees, and it might be the case in North Carolina that you also pay a certain percentage of the capital expenditure as part of your application fee. Some states have that. So he was looking at something like $400,000 to be able to run through that process. Well, obviously that didn't pan out. And, I don't know what he would have charged for his MRI scan, but you can imagine it would be fractional compared to what the hospital down the street was and does charge. So under North Carolina's Certificate of Need law, obviously he's banned from purchasing that scanner. And on the topic of free market, transparent priced imaging and other services, our family had an encounter with this back in maybe 2017. I have a nephew in Houston who had been in a bad motorcycle wreck. He did fine, but he ended up at a level 1 trauma center in Houston, and I did a little write-up about this for the Libertarian Institute around that time. And his emergency room bill alone tallied out to $57,000. And so his dad got the itemized bill sometime later, and just out of curiosity, I asked him if he'd send it to me. And so I took those $57,000 worth of items, which were supplies, lab work, imaging studies, whatnot. And I looked for transparent pricing in just direct type care situations, imaging centers and pharmacies and whatnot. Now, some of that massive bill I could not even decipher. I mean, I'm an anesthesiologist, I work in the system. I couldn't figure out what some of it was. But I was able to pull out about $37,000 worth of stuff I could figure out what it was and find some type of competitive offer in the market for. Of that $37,000 that was billed to him, I tallied retail, not even wholesale, but retail to a consumer. You could have gotten that $37,000 worth of stuff for $3,500. And the most atrocious part of that, with my my witty title here, would you like the $9,400 CT scan or the $450 CT scan? The most atrocious thing in there was a $9,400 CAT scan, abdomen, pelvis, without contrast. I found a free market imaging center. You could go and pay cash, $450. So, is it the Dr. Singh and the Dr. Singleton practices out there that are driving up the costs of healthcare? I don't think that's really the case. We might look at the building in front of the hotel here with the big plastered sign on it. That CEO made $9.5 million in compensation last year. We've got big health system names plastered all over buildings and stadiums and billboards. And we see constant expansion of those buildings. We see constant mergers and acquisitions of the small guys and the small independent hospitals. And I don't think that's helping our cost issues. On to Iowa. Dr. Lee Berchansky, another ophthalmologist, He opened a building, looks like in 1998. Half of that building was surgery center, half was his clinic. He originally, it looks like he was associated with a hospital locally, had either applied for certificate of need and was kind of forced into the association, I'm not sure, but operated until about 2003 with this hospital. So he was able to do his cases at his ambulatory surgery center at his ASC. For whatever reason, that affiliation ended in 2003, and then he was subject to certificate of need application. The building was already in existence. He'd already been doing his surgery for so many years, but from one day to the next, because he wasn't under the protectionist umbrella of a hospital system, all of a sudden he was exposed to certificate of need and has intermittently been shut down, appealed, reapplied, and had the space unused in his clinic from 2013, maybe to 2017, kind of hard to see exactly. But over 20 years, in this article from Institute for Justice, who was also representing him, he had 5 applications, had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars just to try to give his patients the option to work, in his ASC at lower prices. Initially, as the story says, looked like a first-round victory. The judge clears the way for the lawsuit, and this is in 2017 going into 2018. And there's their petition where they had filed against the Department of Public Health, I believe, in Iowa, and you can find that on IJ's website. Interesting reading there. From the petition, IG argued that the con laws are unconstitutional, they don't further public health or safety, they only protect, again, the protectionist racket, they only protect the existing medical providers from competition. Doctors are put in the position where you've got to prove a need, which is probably as much a political term as anything else. It's a very cumbersome process. It's like doing litigation, and then people can appeal you, your competitors can appeal, and you have to go back to square one. And on top of that, in Iowa in particular, the existing businesses are exempt from a lot of the same requirements, so they can open their own surgery centers without having to go through the process. So what it amounts to is this massive, expensive, and often insurmountable barrier to entry for a physician that simply wants to offer his or her services locally and at an affordable, competitive price. And it's another example of regulatory capture, where the big guys are able to put up a lot of barriers and the small people have a hard time competing and overcoming them. From the petition, they state, when Dr. Pachansky was performing in-office cataract surgeries, the only fee he charged in addition to his surgeon's fees was the $200 it cost him to purchase the prosthetic lens. The total cost would have been around $1,000 to $2,000, depending on insurance or Medicare or whatnot. In comparison, the one local hospital, Mercy Medical Center, charged over $8,000 just to walk in the door and pay the facility fee. So the IJ article goes on. The judge initially recognized that this was just naked economic protectionism. It's an illegitimate state interest under the Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses. IJ had represented him pro bono. That lead counsel had said that Iowa must now defend its protectionist program that has limited the rights of Iowans to access safe, convenient, and cost-effective medical care. Dr. Lieberchansky was happy to see the case continue and noticed that all that had happened in the existing situation was that they were handing bigger paychecks to the established businesses. The situation garnered the attention of a senior law student at the University of Iowa who in the law review wrote an article about this economic protectionism, said that each time Berchansky applied for a certificate of need, the local hospitals opposed him. They said that no need existed. One would later go on to open a new outpatient surgery center just 4 miles from his facility. Then they would come down with an appeal and ultimately shut him down. So, he didn't become violent. He didn't write a manifesto. I mean, the guy just went through and I'm sure had to go back to the hospitals that were his competitors, essentially his tormentors, and had to go back there to operate. And for that, I would nominate him for ophthalmologic sainthood. And he with St. Lucy, he could be first assistant to St. Lucy, patroness, saint of eyes and sight. Just a little history and trends. The con laws were invented in order to supposedly keep costs down, quality up, and to increase access for poor people. The Mercatus Center has a great article on how all of that has failed. And in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip through some of that, but I think we can notice that costs have not gone down. I would argue that quality is not better. I don't think patients are happier. And as far as access, what does it mean when I could have gone and gotten a $400 CT scan, but now I've got to go get one that's $9,400? I mean, how many people do we price out of healthcare that could have afforded it in our multi-trillion-dollar health system? Some more of that history. New York State was the first to introduce certificate of need laws. Many states followed. In 1974, there was a federal law, National Health Planning and Resources Development Act, that mandated states have their own certificate of need laws, otherwise they would forfeit federal dollars. So of course they jumped on the bandwagon. 12 years later, by 1986, the feds had realized none of this stuff works. They repealed that, but all the states did not immediately follow suit. But many have. 15, I think, have completely done away with certificate of need, and others are repealing in various fashion. Now, being kind of the perpetual doom and gloom person about the direction of government and state interventions, are we moving in the right direction? And I would have to say there's actually a lot of optimism at the state level for what's happening. And IJ here, in their publication called Conning the Competition, if you're interested at all in this topic, I'd look that up. They go state by state to give you an update. And you can see the white states here on this graphic. They don't have certificate of need laws. They've done away with them. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have some massive hurdles in other areas and regulatory burden, but it won't be under the guise of certificate of need. The dark states are the ones that are very heavily regulated and have the most categories for certificate of need, which are more inclusive than just physician services. That gets into ambulance services and hospices and all kinds of things. Now, out of Montana, also looking good there. The Frontier Institute recently published this about the last legislative session in Montana, where they're looking at repeal and reform. And I wasn't familiar with the Frontier Institute, but have to give them a big plug. I appreciate that they referenced F.A. Hayek. And for any in the room that aren't familiar with his free market ideas, these are great books to start with, Road to Serfdom, and his fatal conceit about the errors of socialism. And they quote from him, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." And that's absolutely true. So state governments are reconsidering. Here we see Matt Mitchell. He's a senior research fellow with Mercatus. He got to talk to the South Carolina Senate Medical Affairs Subcommittee recently as they're considering reforms in that state. And it's really surprising that states haven't been a little more aggressive at abandoning the certificate of need. Here, in as recently as 2004, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission issued a joint report encouraging competition in healthcare. They recognize that these programs are not successful in containing costs, that the risks outweigh their purported economic benefits, that market incumbents can too easily use con laws to forestall competitors, which again, regulatory capture. And there's evidence that these actually increase prices and decrease competition. So what do you do politically? I mean, a lot of you are plugged into political processes. You can talk to your state legislators about full repeal. If there's a lot of resistance, there are all kinds of other things that you can talk about as far as different types of reforms. And if you are plugged into those people, again, like South Carolina did, you can get the Matt Mitchells and others, like at Mercatus, that can offer expert testimony and give evidences from studies and offer solutions. So lobby these people if you're into that. I kind of have the ick factor with with politicians, so I prefer to support the processes by donating to people like AAPS and other groups that work on these things. Vote the bums out. I think my more enlightened recommendation would be get out of some of these states. I don't know if you can change them. Vote with your feet. States matter. I think we see that now more than at any time in the past. I mean, would you have rather lived over the last year and a half in New York or Florida, Michigan or Texas? And so I think going forward, as we look at where trends are headed over the next 10, 20 years, maybe we position ourselves in places that are a little more amenable to breathing and movement. If you're plugged into medical students and residents, talk about these things. We saw Dr. Doherty that talks about free market medicine and options, direct primary care with the residents that come through his family practice program. Students and residents today, they don't have any comprehension of these things. So let's warn them so they can make good initial decisions. So why is it important? I mean, I think if we can get some of the con laws and these other barriers out of the way, it helps support direct primary care and other direct-to-patient type physician services, minimizes the, my words, hyper-regulated, purchased, controlling, trade restraining, protected, price gouging, suffocating state of big medicine. And that's kind of my impression of it all, which may be, I don't think too extremist, but I think that's kind of where we find ourselves. It helps restore the physician-patient relationship, which is what AAPS is all about, bends the medical inflation curve, brings prices down with competition and quality up. And it helps us find a transparent, honest, and I would say moral exchange for our medical services. When I have a patient in the pre-op bay as an anesthesiologist, many times I have them ask me, well, what is this going to cost? So we're going to do a rotator cuff repair. Well, they're going to get a general anesthetic and potentially a nerve block under ultrasound that I do. They don't have to get the nerve block. It helps with pain. I'd certainly get one. They ask me, well, what does that add to my bill? I don't know. I don't know what you'll be billed. I don't know what I'll get paid for that. I have no idea. You'll probably get a $2,000 bill for my services. You'll probably get a $2,000 bill for the CRNA services. You'll probably get a potentially $2,000 bill for a nerve block that I might charge you $100 for. And so here you've got a $6,000 bill maybe, where if I were a Keith Smith at Surgery Center of Oklahoma, I'd offer you that whole bundled thing for $400 or $500 and we'd just call it a day. So there's a moral way forward in breaking out of some of this type of stuff and offering a more transparent approach, I think hits that moral component as well as solving so many other problems. So any errors here, they're not my fault. These are my two main distractors. I can't get any work done. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.